So now that we've seen what the world thinks of us and the fact that we're relevant to no one, our next speaker is going to tell us how we go out and find these markets that do in fact want to buy our product, and how New Zealand might undertake trade policy in both uncertain and, at the moment, very turbulent times. So look, it is my pleasure to welcome up Vangelis Vitalis. So Vangelis is the Deputy Secretary of Trade and Economics at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's New Zealand's chief trade negotiator, who has just, in the last week or so, concluded the New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, the New Zealand-European Union Free Trade Agreement, and has a very long career working in the trade space. Prior to taking up his role in Wellington back in 2017, Vangelis was New Zealand's ambassador to the World Trade Organization, which in today's uncertain and turbulent times, I think probably has many stories to share with us from that perspective as well. But look, recently I ran into Vangelis, and he was telling me about one of his greatest passions, one that is fishing in Wellington. So now that I'm resident in Wellington, it was great to get some tips on where to go. I've still not caught a legal size snapper yet, but I'm working on that. And the other thing that for Vangelis' sins, he remains a long-standing supporter of the Phoenix Football Club. As the parent of mad footballers, I suggest you might want to find a new team to support, although I'm going to put it out there and say best of luck to the Phoenix women, who are actually in the semi-final this weekend in Wellington. And so perhaps they might get your support this week as well. So look, over to you, Vangelis. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And my thanks to Thriving Southland for giving me a chance to come back and speak again here. And as you heard, I like fishing in Wellington. I support Wellington Phoenix, so those are two really difficult things to do, and in a way, a triumph of hope over expectation. So, in a way, that's really good training for the job that we do in our ministry and in MPI and in other places, which is trying to secure access for New Zealand. And I think you heard from Hamish a fantastic overview of the challenge that we actually confront out there, how people see us, how we see ourselves, and how we then need to be thinking about where that puts us in that world. And just to acknowledge Hamish's enormous contribution to our country, because that role of Special Agricultural Trade Envoy is a key part of building confidence and trust, because it's one thing to hear from officials, it's quite another to hear from a fellow farmer. And that has been a very powerful mechanism for us to open doors, whether it was in India, whether it was in the EU, whether it was in the UK, throughout the United States, throughout Latin America, and so on. And it is a hard job, but Hamish, thank you very much for what you did there. Look, I'm going to give a presentation that is going to be somewhat grim, because the world really is a much more difficult place, even than it was when I last spoke here a couple of years ago. But the first thing I wanted to do is remind you that we have had a fantastic run. As New Zealand agricultural exporters, as New Zealand agricultural producers, you've had a golden weather between 1995 through until about 2017, 2018, and then from there it gradually started to decline, and what we're seeing is a much more, unfortunately, a much faster or an acceleration of the disintegration of some working assumptions that we had about the world. So the golden weather was characterised, in my mind, on the New Zealand trade policy side, by three key things. The first is, for the first time in 1995, something called the WTO Agreement on Agriculture was established. And for the first time, rules actually were applied to agricultural exports. And these are not United Nations rules, these are trade rules, they are enforceable rules. And during this period, if a big country broke the rules and denied us access, and we thought that they were breaking those rules, we could take them to court, to this place called the World Trade Organization, and we could settle a dispute. And during this golden weather period, those countries brought their regimes into compliance. And New Zealand has a fantastic track record. We've never lost a case. We've taken 13 in total. They've all been against big countries. We took a case against the United States on sheep meat. They lost. They brought their regime into compliance. We've taken cases against the European Union on butter and cheese access. We've won. they've brought their regimes into compliance. We've taken a case against Indonesia, we've taken a case against Australia, our closest friend, on apples. In each case, we won the case, and those bigger countries than us brought their regimes into compliance. That's a key feature of that period. The second key feature of that period has been a really gradual, we would have certainly liked it to have been faster, but a decline in protectionism. And that's been really important, not just at the border, but behind the border. We got cuts to subsidies, the elimination of agricultural export subsidies. We got a reduction in the overall tariff that New Zealand exporters face from above 60% before 1995 to around 15 to 20%, and then further pushed down by the free trade agreements that Hamish talked about, that we were negotiating alongside this foundational set of rules of the World Trade Organization. And the third feature of the Golden Weather, a really important feature, has been the social license for trade agreements. And by social license, what I mean is that what is important for us as officials is that we know that New Zealanders, more or less and in general, are broadly supportive of trade agreements, that they do agree that these agreements deliver jobs, and they do. 1 in 4 jobs depends on exports, and that figure does not include tourism, and it does not include education services, so arguably it's even higher than that. We also know that exporting is good for incomes, 10 to 14% higher if you're an export-focused industry compared to a domestic industry. And productivity in the exports industry is significantly greater than domestically focused industries, between 42 and 58%. These are significant numbers. And that helps hold together that social license. But the fundamental definition for me of social license, because I'm a practical bureaucrat, is when you conclude a free trade agreement, can you get it ratified through Parliament? And New Zealand's history has been one of bipartisanship between the two big parties in New Zealand, the Labour Party and the National Party. And throughout that golden weather period, the two major political parties, which I would argue broadly represented the broadest view within New Zealand, supported all of the trade agreements that were negotiated, whether it was the CER agreement with Australia, closer economic relationship, the Singapore-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, right through to the China agreement, the agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries, and so on. It's really easy to forget that the China agreement was hugely controversial at the time because of human rights. The agreement was heavily criticised because it took nearly 18 years to get full liberalisation for dairy, and there were visas in the agreement. It's also easy to forget that the agreement we struck with the 10 ASEAN countries was also controversial at the time. We were negotiating with a military dictatorship in Burma, and there were significant criticisms about the time frame for the elimination of tariffs on dairy and beef, which were 12 and 14 years. And yet, in each case, the two major political parties came together to support the agreements and have them ratified through our parliamentary process. So the golden weather period for me is that period when we had rules that worked, that as a small state we could hold the big countries to account, and they would allow themselves to be held to account, and if they were found to be breaching the agreements that we'd negotiated with them, they would bring themselves into compliance. Protectionism was declining, greater returns for the New Zealand farmer and for the New Zealand economy more generally, and my point about social licence. Unfortunately, that's not the world we're in anymore. And there's 3 features to this, I think, and the first feature is really the shift away from rules and to power. And this isn't just a President Trump phenomenon, it's been going on for some time. And I think we should be extremely concerned about what we're seeing. The first point to make is I talked about rules being a feature of the golden weather, that we could take big states to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism in Geneva, and if those big countries lost the case, they would bring their rules, they would bring their regimes into compliance. That system no longer exists. We now do not have a mechanism by which we could take the United States to court, and even if we won the case, we would not be able to enforce our rights through that system anymore. So it's easy to forget how good we had it and how difficult and challenging the world is now becoming. And I want to explain sort of three features of this new world that we're in. First is geopolitics. The second is the behaviour of the big trading powers. And the third is the kind of scenarios that we're looking at in terms of what our trade policy needs to respond to. So the first point to make is we are seeing geopolitics writ large. War in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, still a war going on in Gaza. All of those big challenges, quite apart from the moral and human dimension to all of those, they're having a very significant impact, as you all know, on trade. Then we're seeing the behaviour of the big countries increasingly becoming worse. As I said, not just a President Trump phenomenon. President Trump has clearly broken international trade rules with the way in which he's escalated the tariff, including against a close friend like New Zealand. So we're now on a 15% tariff. It's easy to forget that less than 2 years ago, the average tariff we faced into the United States was less than 5%. And they've escalated the tariff, they've lowered it, and they've escalated it again, and I expect within the next 6 weeks to 8 weeks that the United States will lift that tariff again. So we have this massive uncertainty, but as I said, it's not just the United States that's behaving like this. If you're in any doubt about how difficult and challenging the game is, ask your Australian counterparts, Australian red wine exporters to China, Australian lobster exporters to China, Australian coal exporters to China. They had their trade switched off within 48 hours. All trade from Australia in those particular product categories was stopped because China took offence at comments that Prime Minister Morrison made about the origins of COVID. It took them nearly 3 years to get back up to reopen that trade with China, but it was a reminder that there are some very big powers out there with very sharp elbows. And underlying all of that, you've got the approach that the big countries or the big trading blocs are now taking. The first is, of course, Make America Great. The second is the strategic autonomy, so-called, that the European Union is now pursuing. The third is China with its dual circulation theory. And then there's India with its Make in India policy. All four of those national policies are about local protectionism, local production, to drive food security of the kind of things that Hamish was talking about, and that all spells bad news to a major global exporter like us. It means markets are starting to close. It means the rules aren't working. It means protectionism is back and rising fast. And increasingly, I am concerned about the social licence in New Zealand to continue negotiating trade agreements. And we're seeing that play out in real time now. So what is our approach to all of this? So our trade policy strategy is on 3 pillars. The first is we still want rules. We still want to be negotiating rules to deliver certainty for New Zealand exporters, to make sure that you can still get access at a level of transparency, and we still want those rules to push down protectionism. We're just going to have to think differently about how we make those rules work. So we are still going to negotiate free trade agreements. We've just done one with India. But we are going to have to think differently about the place where we negotiate. We may not be able to negotiate anymore in the World Trade Organization, but there are still more than 100 countries that do want to negotiate more rules. So are there groups of countries that we can work with to try to drive more rules to give you more certainty, greater transparency, and hopefully improved conditions to trade in? Our second pillar is building resilience domestically. And Exhibit A is very much what the Prime Minister and Minister Macleay signed a couple of days ago in Singapore. It's a new generation type of trade agreement where we're trying to secure each other's supply lines. So Singapore's a major supplier of fuel to us. We are a major supplier of food to Singapore. And what that agreement does, a world-first agreement, is it essentially says, in the Prime Minister's words, we've got each other's backs. So we will supply them with food, they will supply us with fuel, and we will not impose restrictions on each other, which is one of the big risks that we're seeing out there when you look at the behaviour of China, Korea, indeed the United States, even Europe, who are imposing export restrictions in response to a crisis. So the resilience piece certainly has in there the very orthodox elements of trying to secure our position, secure our supply lines, and secure the products that we need. So it's not just fuel, it's plastics, it's fertilisers, it's all of those things that we're going to need to think differently about how our trade agreements might be able to help us. Another important part of the feature of the resilience is we do have these trade agreements. As Hamish said, just over 70%, we reckon it's now about 73%, of all of New Zealand's exports are now covered by these other international treaties called free trade agreements. Really important to remember those free trade agreements do have rules in them, and those rules, because these are trade rules, are enforceable. So we're not using the World Trade Organization anymore, but we can use these other free trade agreements to enforce our rights. And we've just done that against Canada, because with Canada we have what's called the CPTPP agreement. We believe that they were misusing, to put it impolitely, cheating us on the tariff that we'd negotiated with them on a number of milk powder and butter lines. We won that case, and to Canada's credit, it has brought its regime more or less, they are Canadians after all, back into compliance. So we are finding different ways to use the rules to try to ensure that we've got some resilience back into our system, to ensure we've got that certainty back out. But the resilience is not just about the existing agreements, it's about needing to upgrade them over time. This is one of my other messages. It's all very well to have the agreement with the EU and the UK. As Hamish has said, the EU agreement alone in the last 18 months has added $3 billion of exports to us, for us into the European Union. $3 billion, that's a 38% increase in our exports to the EU, driven out of the free trade agreement, 28% to the UK. These agreements are going to need to be updated. So within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be in a negotiation with the EU, with the British, with our other partners. We are already in a negotiation with the CPTPP countries to improve the agreement, to make sure that it's got the best in class, that whatever they've given someone else, that we're going to get it now as well. But we must not forget that when we conclude those agreements, they have to go through the parliamentary process. Like us, in New Zealand, we have a select committee process. The bills get read 3 times. You appear in front of the Parliamentary Select Committee to present your evidence. Same thing happens in those other countries, whether it's Japan, whether it's Canada, whether it's the EU or the UK. And our experience when we first concluded the agreements with the UK and the EU is a very vivid one. We were not asked how we were going to benefit from the agreement. We were not asked about what it would do to prices. The overwhelming focus of the examination that we got from the British Select Committee that was hearing our evidence on our agreement, and the EU European Parliament parliamentary hearings, which were in 3 parts, agriculture, environment and trade. Over 90% of the questions we were asked, and if you add in animal welfare questions, nearly 98% of the questions we were asked were about what we were doing on the environment, on climate change, and on animal welfare. So I deal with the world as it is, not the way I wish it was, and I cannot imagine that in 3 years' time, when we appear in front of those parliamentary committees again, that the situation will be any different. We will be asked, how is it going? What's the water quality like? How much fertiliser are you using? Are your emissions coming down? What's the evidence for that? What's the database? It's a rigorous process that we have to go through. If we want to sustain the access that we've got to have that narrative has to be robust, sustainable, credible. It is all about our reputation. So the resilience part of our strategy also needs to include how it is we're going to manage those challenges. That is if we want to keep those agreements going. Because, as Hamish has pointed out, none of these people really want to be competing with New Zealand product in their markets. In my experience of appearing in front of those committees, both in the UK and in the EU, it was hard not to feel somewhat cynical about French representatives asking you about the environment when you knew that what they really were concerned about was finding ways to keep you out. So slip-ups by us have consequences. The third area that we're focused on is innovation. So rules, resilience, and innovation. And the innovation piece is not just these new generation agreements that we're trying to do to protect our supply lines in this much more turbulent world, but it's also trying to do new things with new partners, or rather, new things with old partners, because one of the initiatives that the Prime Minister launched late last year was a CPTPP EU dialogue. That's a block of countries, the CPTPP 12 members and the EU, it's about to expand by the way, but the CPTPP 12 plus the EU 27, bringing those together, that's about 30% of global GDP, so a significant trading block. And to think of what rules we could develop inside that block, because we know that some of the other big powers are not interested in negotiating new rules. And one of the things that we talked about with the European Union about 3 weeks ago in Cameroon during the WTO ministerial is to develop a digital agreement between the two blocks. The two blocks together account for about 60% of global digital trade in services across a whole range of products that are driven through the digital space. And for us as an agricultural export nation, the key thing is that we can make sure that our certification is digitally recognised and acknowledged by all of those partners. We estimate that could cost costs for New Zealand exporters between 10 and 16%. And in this period, that kind of change is definitely a non-trivial saving for us. So rules, resilience and innovation, those are the focus areas for us as we try to manage the turbulence and the uncertainty that we face out there. That then brings me to the New Zealand-India Free Trade Agreement. Last week, it was a privilege to be there in Delhi to watch Minister Macleay sign this agreement. And this agreement is important for 3 reasons. The first reason is we're going to level the playing field with some of our competitors who are already in the market and have free trade agreements. And we're going to catch up with Australia, with the UK, who already have agreements there, the European Free Trade Area countries, Switzerland, Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland, who have an agreement there. And we also know that the European Union's now finished a deal with India, so has the United States. We know that many of our Latin American competitors, Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, are all busy negotiating with India as well. So we've got to be in there to level the playing field and keep up. The second reason we want to be in that market is forget about the 1.4 billion people in India. Our focus must be the Indian middle class. Within 5 years, the middle class in India, defined as people with a US dollar 32,000 income by the IMF, that number is going to be greater than the entire population of the EU, and it is also bigger than the entire population of the 10 ASEAN countries. So this is a middle class with an expanding and growing taste for the kind of safe, sustainable, high-quality food and products that New Zealand can deliver to them. So it's about levelling the playing field, it's about getting access quickly to this new middle class, and the third important element is it creates options. We cannot be solely dependent on 1 or 2 major players, US and China. We've seen how challenging and uncertain that can be. The new opportunities in India offers another way for exporters to think about how they're going to manage their risk in this time of uncertainty. So what did we get? So the Australia-India FTA, before the Australia-India FTA, New Zealand had 85% of the sheep meat market in India. Today, we're at 9%. And that is driven exclusively by the fact we simply cannot compete against Australian product, even though, of course, we're a better product, when the Australian product is 33% cheaper in the market than we are. And that's the significance of Indian tariff. So the Indian tariff on sheep meat is 33%. Every $100 we send, we've got to pay a $33 tax. The Australians don't pay that at the moment. And so they have taken it, they've had 3 years in that market essentially wiping the floor with us. The good news is that because when the FTA comes into force, we will immediately be on the same level playing field as the Australians and the British, who are emerging as another competitor in that market. Forestry. We've learnt the hard way that China, with the building industry starting to slow down there, and in the United States, when we used to have very low tariffs, and now we're on a 10% tariff into the United States on wood, just escalated to 15. We know that we need to have more options, and what we've seen in the Indian market is that we've fallen in terms of our market share, while the Australians have rapidly increased there. Tariff is between 11 and 14%, so still significant, especially when margins are tight. Fish and seafood, we know what happens when you take away the tariff because we look at the Australian experience. Shot up, admittedly from a low base, but nevertheless they've been building that market, and we have essentially fallen out of that market. But because the free trade agreement comes into force, from day one, the tariffs will go from 33% to 0 on all of the bulk products that we send, mussels, hoki, squid, and within 7 years the remainder will get eliminated as well, which keeps us up with Australia. Kiwi fruit and apples, so India has never given access to anyone, and still hasn't, for kiwi fruit. What we've negotiated is what's called a quota, which allows us to send a certain amount of tonnes of kiwi fruit, up to 15,000 tonnes, which is nearly 4 times what we exported over the last 3 years to India. We can send that now tariff-free, so our Chilean competitors are paying a 33% tariff, we're paying 0. And even outside of that, so for the first tonne over the 15,000 tonnes, we can get the preferential rate of 16.5%, and again, giving us a real edge over our competitors in a market where we really want the Indian consumer to be having access to high-quality New Zealand kiwi fruit. Same story in apples, 50% tariff, a really constraining tariff with a real chilling effect on trade. What we've negotiated is about 4 times what we exported over the last 3 years, again a volume-based outcome, but cut the tariff in half to give us that edge over our competitors, whether they're from the United States, the EU, Australia, wherever they might be, we will have that 25% margin. And in horticulture more generally, we've got an outcome where we cut that tariff of 33%, depending on the product, happens on day 1, happens on year 3, happens on year 7, and happens in year 10. Essentially what we've done is we've caught up with Australia, and we've got a slight edge depending on when we ratify our agreement over our European and American competitors who are catching up fast. Dairy, not going to pretend that the agreement is perfect, and on dairy we're very disappointed indeed. All I can say is Minister Macleay, right up until the last minute, right up until the 4 a.m. When we were negotiating, was still pushing and trying to keep dairy on. India has never opened the market on dairy. It didn't open it for the European Union, didn't open it for the United States, certainly didn't open it for Australia and the UK. That's not much comfort, but we did get something. So you can see here we got the tariff eliminated on infant milk formula, dairy-based food preparations, whey protein concentrates. So we didn't get nothing, we got something, but we are clearly disappointed with that. The other elements that we did get that no one else has got is we have this ability to supply ingredients to Indian processors, and as long as it doesn't enter the Indian market but goes to other markets, and the Indians want to be exporting to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh, but also to Europe, to the United States, and using New Zealand ingredients which meets the standards in those other markets could be a real edge for those Indian producers. And what we're hoping to do is make sure that we can get in there, because at the moment, if you supply an ingredient to the Indian processor, you have to pay the tariff. And the tariff is between 12 and 42%, but what we've got here is if you supply those ingredients, the tariff will be 0. And then the other thing that we got, because we were worried that India might give access to the Europeans or the Americans, who have a lot of negotiating power with the Indians, they're more or less peers, we've got a legal obligation in the agreement that India must talk to us if they've given something better to any other major exporter, including the EU and the United States. Of course, we now know from what we've seen from the United States and the EU that India indeed has been as good as its word. It has not given dairy access to anyone else, but nevertheless we at least have that legal commitment to go back to the Indians and say, hang on a minute, you've given it to them, why wouldn't you give it to us? We also have a built-in review process, and because we are so worried and wanting to make sure we can keep dairy at the forefront, normally when we review trade agreements, it's usually set at about 5 years. This agreement has got a review after year 1 of the agreement and then every 2 years thereafter. This is our attempt to future-proof the agreement, particularly in the dairy sector. What we've also got in the agreement is what's called the most favoured nation provision, and that is the idea that if India gives better treatment to anyone else in wine, we will get the same treatment. And already we've seen the benefit of that come through. So the wine tariff in India is 150%. We've negotiated that down to 25% for New Zealand white wine, New Zealand white and red, New Zealand wine full stop, which is a good outcome, not a great outcome, but we were pretty satisfied because we'd at least caught up with Australia. We also knew our competitors like the Chileans and the Argentinians would still be paying 150%, but we also got this, what's called the MFN, the Most Favoured Nation provision in there. That immediately has become very significant to us because the European Union got an agreement from the Indians to drop the tariff from 25 to 20. So from 150, we're on 25, the Europeans are on 20, but we will automatically get what the Europeans got so long as we can get our agreement ratified before the Europeans ratify their agreement. So there is some urgency to making sure we do this. We also have the same provision in the services area. So for education services, engineers, architects and so on, whatever the Indians give anyone else, they have to automatically also extend to us. Again, our effort to try to future-proof this agreement for us. There's been a lot of talk about the visas, and all I want to do is present to you what the agreement says. So there are 1,667 visas for Indians to come to New Zealand to work. Those categories are not unskilled or low-skilled workers. They are off what's called the New Zealand Green List. So they are occupational categories where there is a shortage in New Zealand. They are engineers. They are nurses. They are software engineers, IT professionals. And in order for an Indian to qualify for the visa, they have to have a job offer from an accredited New Zealand employer who's accredited to the Ministry of Immigration, to MB. They have to be able to prove their tertiary qualifications are recognised here in New Zealand, so they have to have a tertiary degree. They have to have English language to a sufficient level, so a very high 6.5 grade out of the 8 in IELTS, which is a very high level. And all of our existing policy settings remain in place around those visas. But these visas are not renewable. So under our existing policy, an Indian who comes through as an engineer, who comes through now before the FTA comes in, can stay on as long as the employer continues to give them a job. This one, there's a 3-year stand down. So once they've had the job, the visa for 3 years, they have to leave and they have to stand down for 3 years. And explicitly written into the agreement, there is no pathway to permanent residence and no pathway to citizenship. The other feature of the agreement is 1,000 working holiday visas. Again, no pathway to citizenship, no pathway to residence. And these are similar to the agreement that we negotiated with China, where we also did 1,000 working holiday visas. We've got a whole lot of working holiday schemes with other countries which are in the 20 to 30,000, the UK, Germany and so on. but this was an important feature of the agreement, certainly for us and our Indian counterparts. Then we've got graduate post-study work visas, so that is when an Indian national comes in, he studies or she studies in New Zealand. They have the ability then, under current legislation, to also then work for a set period between 2 and 4 years, depending on the degree, and we've continued that through the free trade agreement. Under current policy, the last point on my slide, under current policy in New Zealand, a student, whether you're a German, a Greek, a French, a Malaysian student, you have the right to work in New Zealand for up to 25 hours. What we've said to India is you can have, as a baseline, it'll be 20 hours for you. So we've simply codified existing practice because the existing practice is actually greater than that. So I want to close my presentation by making the observation that while you look out into that world and it's a world of uncertainty, turbulence, the golden weather's really over for New Zealand agricultural exporters, that jungle is definitely growing back and the big economies are really starting to behave pretty badly. But what I hope I've given you a sense of is despite the difficulties out there and the challenges that we face, we've got a strategy to manage this. And that strategy is rules. We're still wanting to get rules. We're going to negotiate very orthodox free trade agreements, like the India Free Trade Agreement, to make sure we can get certainty, transparency, and advantage in some of those key markets for us. We're looking to build resilience, but we've got to be on our game. And the third area is we're going to innovate. We're trying to make sure that we're really at the cutting edge of digital trade, for example. We're trying to find ways to find different partners and groups that we can work with to drive forward. Again, it's all about providing you a better return at the farm gate, a better return for exporters, creating jobs, driving productivity, and driving incomes here in New Zealand. So despite all of that, I hope I've given you a sense that there is a structured strategy here that we believe will flatten out some of those really big risks and challenges that we face out there. Thank you very much. Sorry, I should have ended by... So I've always used this, and you'll have heard it 1,000 times from me. President Reagan used to say the 10 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But we really are, and if I can ask you, there's one thing that I really would appreciate. If you took one thing out of here, please go to the Market Intelligence Report. It's a free service. It's your taxpayer dollar at work. These are 1 to 2 page reports. Every fortnight we produce a general global trade and economic outlook piece. Pretty much every time the United States announces something, we've got a report up on our website that we work on together with MPI, with Customs, with NZTE, to give you the most accurate and up-to-date information. And the other thing is, if you or your agents are having trouble exporting, please do let us know. Just to go back to the India FTA, one thing we're really keen on is making sure that we get the benefit of this agreement. One of the things that we negotiated in that agreement was customs clearance. So customs clearance in India is actually much more efficient than you think. It takes about 4 to 5 days. But we have a legal commitment in the agreement that India will clear, and we will do the same for Indian products, but that India will clear New Zealand product within 48 hours across its borders, a legal obligation. And that for perishable products, seafood, horticulture, it's 24 hours. Those are legal obligations that India's made to us. We need to hold them to account, which is why up here you've got these contact points. There's no wrong door. MPI, us, Customs, NZTE, please let us know. Let us know if that's not happening for you, once the agreement's been passed by our Parliament, that is. But once that happens, you need to be in touch with us. We really are here to help. And I don't just mean the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but I do mean a cross-agency group. A lot of the non-tariff barrier work, that fantastic work that gets done, it's not just our ministry, it's definitely MPI, for example, our NZTE colleagues. We work together and we are there to help our exporters succeed internationally, especially when we're having trouble at the borders. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Vangelis. I think...
A cheap way to get 2 claps.
No, that's okay. We can probably provide you some more shortly. But look, I think, thank you for sharing your ethos around triumph of hope over expectation. I think you have probably the hardest job in the country dealing with all the uncertainty in the trade world. And I guess to pick up on something that you shared with right at the beginning of your presentation with us, and there's been a question come through on Slido, you know, you talked about social licence, and you started out by saying that obviously not many people actually want to play with New Zealand because they see us as a threat, and then you talked about social licence. And I guess what I'm really interested in understanding is, how do you dig into what you mean by social licence in the context of trade, and what does that mean for our farmers and growers on the ground every day in the things that they're doing, and how that might have an influence on trade or on countries not wanting to trade with us?
I mean, I'd make 2 observations on that. One is, one of the challenges on trade agreements is hearing not just farmer voices, but exporter voices, views and perspectives on those agreements. It's too often, it's officials and ministers who present on trade agreements, but we don't actually hear what exactly you think about that in a public arena. It is really important, whether you're in favour or against, we do want to hear from you, and we do want those voices to be heard in a public arena. There is a risk that some very loud voices, who can be very critical or equally very positive, dominate the discourse, when actually the people that really matter are the people that are actually using these agreements, so the exporters who may or may not benefit from them. So if I had a plea, it would first of all be that we hear those voices more. And my second observation is, if we don't have the social licence to negotiate, and if there is a sense from our negotiating partner that they look at us and think, we're not sure that New Zealand is actually going to be able to get this agreement across the line back home, why would we bother? And in particular, if that partner looks at us and thinks, so this agreement's going to be controversial in New Zealand, do I, country X, want to be the lightning rod for all the concerns and frustrations that New Zealanders might have about the trade agreement or aspects of that trade agreement? So for our trading partners, they've traditionally looked at us and understood that when we do a deal, we're able to get it through our parliament, and there are, of course, the usual challenges in a robust democracy, but those partners can see that that is a reasonable expectation. I'm not sure that they will see that right now, and I think that's going to be one of our big challenges. Is it's hard enough to get our partners internationally to negotiate with us, but if they see that not only are we a threat to them in the agriculture sector for all the good reasons that Hamish lined up, or rather, Hamish said we're less of a threat than people perceive, but that perception is a real problem. But if on top of that they see they're going to get dragged into domestic controversies, those countries are going to pause and think hard about whether it's really worth the pain of negotiating with a small market, 5 million people, where actually, as my Indian counterpart always pointed out to me, actually India has no problems with New Zealand. They have access to the market. The tariff in New Zealand is less than 2% on Indian products. They don't have any big issues with us. We're only a 5 million market. We're not going to make a big difference to them. And 1,667 visas for a population of 1.4 billion doesn't even feature in the way in which they thought about the agreement. So if we make that more challenging, that I think is a real risk for us.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight. Look, we have got a number of questions that are coming through that we will pick up with you in the panel later on. So thank you once again for sharing your insights.